Hello everyone, and welcome to the technical session 12, which includes Professor Francoise Besson, Dr. Tereza Kuldova, Dr. Vanessa and our chair as Professor Pramod Narayan. So I would like to address the speakers and the chair. Francoise Besson is Professor Emerita of Literature in English in the University of Toulouse, France, and a writer. Her research focuses on the relationship between landscape, particularly mountains, and writing, and ecology and literature in English. Her most recent book is Ecology in Literature in English, Writing to Save the Planet 2019. Vanessa is a postdoctoral researcher at the Postcolonial Studies Center in Linneaus University, Sweden. She holds a DPhil from the University of Oxford. Her research interests include post-colonial theater and film, gender studies, and European, Asian, and Caribbean theaters. She is also a playwright and theater practitioner. Tereza Kuldova, PhD, is a social anthropologist and senior researcher at the Work Research Institute, Oslo Metropolitan University. She is the author of, among others, How Outlaws Win Friends and Influence People, Palgrave 2019, Luxury Indian Fashion, a Social Critique, Bloomsbury 2016, Editor of Crime, Harm and Consumerism, Routledge 2020, Outlaw Motorcycle Clubs and Street Gangs, Scheming Legality, Resisting Criminalization, Palgrave 2018, Urban Utopias, Excess and Expulsion in Neoliberal South Asia, Palgrave 2017, and Fashion India, Spectacular Capitalism, Academica Publishing 2013. She has written extensively on topics ranging from populism, organized crime, nationalism, philanthrocapitalism, legitimacy, sovereignty, fashion, design, aesthetics, branding, intellectual property rights, philanthropy, India to outlaw motorcycle clubs, subcultures, and anti-establishment resentment. She is currently working on the topics of algorithmic governance, surveillance, and artificial intelligence in policing and the welfare state. She is the founder and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Extreme Anthropology. To address our chair, Professor Pramod Narayan teaches at the Department of English, University of Hyderabad. He is the recipient of President of Award for Best Research in Humanities for the year 2018. Now over to Professor Francoise Besson.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to thank AURO University and the organizers of this wonderful conference, particularly Professor Pramod Nayar and Dr. Amdwe Reddy and all the organizers. Well, this presentation originated first in a text that I wanted to write. It was in French for friends who could hardly bear lockdown. So this was adapted for this conference. Well, the consequences of a small virus are huge, sad first, and then positive. The solution given in most parts of the world to avoid the exponential spreading of the virus was lockdown. In a world where we live freely, where we can go, walk, ride, drive, fly, wherever we want and whenever we want, when we can afford it, being confined was first felt as imprisonment, and blues invaded many of us, more particularly those who were alone. And yet, in a world where there are so many inequalities, for once we were all alike, all confined. By being alone, we were learning that we lived together on the same space, the earth. Freedom. Everybody loves freedom. This is why I first felt some blues, as I had the impression my freedom was attacked. And yet, as days went by, we realized that this lockdown revealed to us the simplest thing in the world. We are free. Free to live imprisoned in a world that we poison and destroy, or free to change something. This lockdown gives us a chance to free ourselves from our selfish consumerist behaviors, which a small virus born in the body of a small animal in a forest and rapidly spreading to the whole world teaches us. COVID-19 makes us not passive creatures detached from what may happen to our fellows, but active creatures who, because they are locked down, help those who devote every second of their lives to cure, heal. save men and women, and sometimes lose their own lives to save others. Well, everybody understood that the best thing was to stay at home. And to go out of the blues, the initial blues, there are paths we can take. The first one is the path of our minds. We can go in circles on an interior track, always bringing us back to the same point. We must first manage to get out of that mental interior track. As soon as we have found the small door hidden behind the branches of our minds, we start breathing more freely. We realize that behind the small door that we could not see because there were so many branches hiding it, there is a whole universe. And once we have found how to get out of the circle of frustrations, we can set out to explore all the paths. How many things we discover. We rediscover our closest relatives, even if they are far, for we realize then that closeness and distance are only abstractions. Social distancing, which at the beginning made us fear deeper distancing, proves to be, once we have gone out of our closed circle, some consciousness of closeness in distance. As we cannot be close to our close relatives or friends, we call them, we write to them, we want to be close to them and show them that they are not alone, that we are with them, that we are together in the same ship, and they do the same. We are somewhat like Noah's animals on the ark. We rediscover everything. We rediscover our homes. We rediscover books and the pleasure of reading. We rediscover the happiness of taking one's time, the time of simple things. We rediscover wonder, the wonder of every moment, the wonder of everyday life. The blues becomes a love song sung to the world and speaking of simple joys. We rediscover other people. Being obliged to stay alone to protect them, we remember that other people exist and that each of us has an impact on the rest of the world. Like the little pangolin. He should have been left in his Chinese forest. Humans should have let him live on, at home. The little pangolin that has been killed has shown the impact of one gesture towards one being, a gesture that has consequences on the whole world. The Chinese pangolin is Coleridge's albatross. A being killed breaks the balance of the world. The rhyme of the ancient mariner has been replayed in the forests of China in a viral version. So we rediscover the interconnectedness between beings and things. The human non-respect for a protected species and for animals as a whole, the overexploitation of the resources of the planet, industrialization and the race for profit get united to warm and to warm the world. Glaciers melt, threatening islands and coastal regions because of the increased level of oceans. At the same time, they liberate viruses that were deactivated by code and that can return to active service as soon as the protecting ice has melted. We find the way to thought. And after opening the little hidden door in our minds, we open the window, the true one, the one showing us the earth and the sky, nature in spring. For it is just before that this virus spread, and it's week before spring that we were locked down, as if we needed to be confined to be able to look outside and to listen to spring, to be able to understand the song and meaning of spring. And as soon as we listened to the song of birds, the wind whispering in the trees, the murmur of a brook in Pyrenees, Oregon, Kent, or India, the crackling of in which the dog walks the night, we know that we are not confined. We are free. We are free to listen to the bird's song, free to look at cloud in the blue sky, free to wonder at the rose and orange-colored rising sun, free to look at the full moon writing in the sky the story of a drastic change in the luminous superimposition of spring, the Jewish Passover, and Christian Easter. We are free to look at a dead pear tree living again with the colors of a rose bush and with the song of birds eating seeds in its branches. The path to thought leads us on the one of observation, unless it should be the other way around. We learn again how to look and to listen and to wonder. Friends send virtually sublime landscapes. Who needs to leave homes has to be a friend. An English writer and mountaineer who climbed the mountains of the world for more than 50 years and goes on traveling by teaching and guiding our travelers and mountaineers. For if you can no longer travel and climb, you can read. And accepting the moment when you can set out your path, you can dream. It's also what lockdown teaches us, to dream and to be aware of essential things again, like the first of them, breathing. Breathing metaphorically by taking time, but also breathing for life. Breathing as a vital act. A philosopher made us notice that the virus was linked to breathing. We should not miss this theme of breathing shown to us. In the serious cases, the virus is defeated as such, but by disappearing from the body, it lets the body in a total chaos. By fighting the virus, the body launches a lethal attack against itself. It attacks what allows it to breathe, exactly as humans attack the planet's body, and thus doing, destroy themselves. Breathing. This is also what the planet does while humans stay at home. It breathes at last. Fish come back into Venice Lagoon. Birds can quietly breed. Pollution has drastically decreased. This virus, which causes serious pulmonary troubles out of a domino effect, reveals solutions so that the earth and its inhabitants could breathe. Humans should be discreet. All humans in industrialized countries should stop devouring the planet and poisoning the air all humans and other species breathe, and the water all humans and other species drink. And they should remember that they share this planet and this air with all the other humans and all the other species. There will never be enough hyacinth to absorb all the poison that we send out. But this lockdown shows us the solution: to change our behaviors, to change our ways of living, to change the system. Less must be the new more, Jeff Gibbs says in the conclusion of his documentary film produced by Michael Moore, Planet of the Humans. We must learn to go on with what this confinement has taught us, to consume less, to enjoy the present moment, to build a breathable future, where we stop confiscating lands, air, water, lives, to rebuild a world where we understand that the person admiring a blue hyacinth near a lake in the valley of Anne or in a wood of Kent is a poet. You know, those people are often described as gentle dreamers, and who, because they show the way to defend the life, peoples, and lands, are murdered, like Ensarawiwa in Nigeria. These scientists who decide to plant trees and are imprisoned, like Wangari Maathai in Kenya, before awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, or are murdered because they defend animals and their habitats, Diane Fossey in Rwanda or Bruno Manza in Malaysia. These modest rubber workers who, because they defend land and workers, are murdered like Tom Mendes in Brazil, and all the seringueiros, these anonymous landless peasants in Brazil, who were here just because they wanted to live on their lands, in their houses, peasants, poets, priests, all murdered because they had defended the earth and its inhabitants. Maybe poets and scientists are dreamers, but one day dreams come true. All scientific progresses start in observation and dream. Start with imagination, as Einstein said one day. This virus leads us to awareness. Illusion reminds us that humans and non-humans live together. It reminds humans that they share this planet with all the other species. When one of them is killed, the whole world is affected. The biological virus holds out a mirror to us and reveals how the virus of money and profit has contaminated the whole world. Confined in our homes, are we sure that the blues is really our interior music? Are we sure that we are deprived of freedom? We are confined, but we are free. Free to think, free to love, free to share, to love this world and to be aware of its beauty and to share it with all its other inhabitants. The whole world is our home, our common home, which we can preserve only when we take care of it together. We are free to change, and spring, ignoring the virus and only concentrated on renewal, shows us the way. So instead of playing again and again that blues confining us in our minds, let's open the windows and listen to the songs of birds. Let's listen to the voice of spring, the path of spring, which every day shows us life in change. Let's open our windows onto spring's blue skies and flowers, and let's hear the voices of change. And I would like to end with the end of a poem I wrote during the lockdown. The blues of confinement dissolved into the blue of the sky, into the blue of the mountain hyacinths that were wild once, into the blue stars of the bush of town havens and the tiny flakes of discreet Veronica. The blues has vanished into the blue of spring that writes the story of the earth on the soil of a closed garden, open on the world, and in the colors and the songs, it lets the ink of change to come flow on the world. And I want to conclude this conclusion with a word by Vandana Shiva for her message for the new year 2020, when she said, "We're beginning the decade of transition, the decade of possibilities, the decade of moving out, an age where we are awoken, an age of separation, sorry, an age where we are awoken to the fact that we are interbeings. We can live in gardens, working with the other species, working with the soil, working with the insects." And she ends saying, "Let's sow the seeds of love." Work with. Everything is in that little word, with. What this virus said, along with the lockdown appearing in spring, is that there is another kind of spreading. The spreading of toxicity, any kind of toxicity, may be replaced by the spreading of seeds, seeds of plants, seeds of love, seeds of hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Besson.
Thank you.
That's a very reflective and meditative piece. We will take all questions together after the speakers have finished. Thank you for sticking to time as well. We now move on to the second session, the second paper of the session. Professor Tereza Kuldova of the Oslo Metropolitan University on algorithmic governance and the possible futures of intelligence surveillance in the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis. Over to you, Tereza.
Thank you. Thank you, Pramod. Can you hear me?
Yes. Is she
Brilliant.
audible to everyone else? I hope so. All right,
Good.
right. You're on.
Yeah. I think it's
Thank you so much. And and thank you to Om and Pramod, to you for inviting me. This has been very exciting so far. So I would like to change the topic from this quite poetic contribution into a more dark topic of contemporary capitalism, I would say. And I would like to talk a bit about the expansion of intelligence surveillance as a consequence of this crisis. Yeah, I can hear myself. Okay, so as a consequence of this COVID-19 pandemic, we are seeing that governments across the world are starting to use contact tracing apps, quarantine apps, facial recognition technologies, drones, other forms of intelligent surveillance. And indeed, we are increasingly facing a form of blackmail, even in liberal democracies, where we are being told that in order to open up the economy, we have to embrace these technologies. We have to voluntarily download all these tracking apps, and this will enable the economy to restart. And indeed, all of a sudden, even in countries like Norway, we are hearing that the Chinese model has been extremely successful and we should follow the Chinese model, basically. And whatever critique there has been of the surveillance technologies in China, of the social credit system and so on, seems to have evaporated as a consequence of this crisis. And we are very much willing to embrace all these technical solutions that I believe personally are pseudo solutions, post-political, technocratic solutions that are not real solution addressing the real problem at hand. But in any case, we're seeing the embrace of this, and there has been a critique of this coming from human rights perspective, privacy perspectives, and so on. And we have been hearing that obviously all this technology can be easily abused and used for another kind of purpose. And all these things are obviously valid. And we're seeing also how applications that are first introduced as voluntary become mandatory. First, in the case of Poland, we have seen this very clearly, where a quarantine app has been suddenly used as that was voluntarily initially has become mandatory, and you're forced to upload upon receiving an SMS an image of your face and so on. So this has been happening in India. You've seen that from today onwards, the Arogya Setu app is being made obligatory for private and public employees. So you can see that workers' rights are actually being threatened in practice, and workers' privacy is being threatened. And of course, the interesting thing here is that we still keep thinking about privacy as a right. But what we are actually seeing in practice is that privacy is becoming a luxury. We live in an economy where all our data, or our private data, has been effectively commodified. So we are our own currency. Our private data is currency, and it is a new oil for a transnational tech economy. And indeed, if you want to have and retain privacy, you in fact have to pay for it, right? So if you want to have privacy on the internet, you have to pay for services that provide privacy. Otherwise, you may receive free services, and that's where you are the payment, you are the currency, your digital footprint is the currency. And so I think it is interesting to say, and to return a bit to the point that Shashi Tharoor was making today, is to see what is happening globally with the economy. So on one hand, we have this massive globalization of data. As we are all forced into our own homes, we are simultaneously forced into the digital world such as we are today. And indeed, this provides a perfect opportunity for the tech industry to consolidate its power. And we're already seeing that. The biggest, Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, Palantir, and all these are going through the roof on the stock market. So they're making enormous fortunes on this. And what is happening is the smaller startups are beginning to lay off people, they are going bankrupt, or they have to sell themselves to these corporations. So you see that there is a consolidation of power globally within the tech industry, and especially within the biggest monopolistic actors. And at the same time, we're seeing the effects of this kind of parallel deglobalization when it comes to the actual commodities. So you have these ideas of degrowth and protectionism, return of nationalism, self-sufficiency, preparedness, and all these things. At the same time as you have an increasing inequality, as people are becoming unemployed, as you have increasing hunger in many places. If you have, like for instance in Lebanon, you're basically risking the middle class completely disappearing. You have a massive protests that are driven by literally hunger. You have increasing poverty, you have increasing anxiety, stress, and so on. So you are living in a time of increasing inequality where a certain amount of tech corporations are gaining more and more power. Now, what does this happen? What does this mean in practice? They, of course, are pushing since a certain amount of time a certain ideology, which we can call as solutionism, right? So they present technology as the solution to the crisis. And this we are seeing increasingly. There are increasing private-public partnerships where this ideology is actually being implemented, such as in all these tracking apps that are presented as a solution. And of course, in every single crisis that we have seen so far, this has kind of changed this relationship. So we can think back to 9/11. During 9/11, the primary problem that has been identified for the security agencies was that they were not sharing data. So data sharing has become the main force, basically. All of a sudden, after 9/11, you have increasing, growing security industry, of course, but you also have cross-agency data sharing. This is where this whole idea that we must share data at that time between the agencies, but now increasingly we are of course encouraged to do that as well as good citizens. So you have that. And of course, Snowden has revealed the extent of these kind of surveillance technologies. And prior to the COVID crisis, we have seen the Clearview AI scandal, basically. Or the Clearview AI has been scraping all these social media profiles and putting it into a policing tech and so on. So you're basically seeing that the industry, which has previously, or initially, it's been a military industry, but later has primarily been interested in consumerism, in making profit by advertising and so on. That industry has now been moving into security systems and increasingly into governance, increasingly into replacing basically the state and providing solutions which are solutions within governance. And again, within the financial crisis, I think this is interesting to see what kind of idea of the good citizen emerges whenever a crisis strikes. So during the financial crisis, if you can remember 2008, we have been told that we must be good citizens, and being a good citizen meant that we must consume, we must shop, we must keep the economy going by shopping, by being good consumers. And of course, by also increasingly sharing our own consumer preferences and so on online. And during this current crisis, I think that we have a new paradigm, which has been there for a while, but which is intensified, I would argue, is where we see that the new ideal citizen is a transparent citizen. It's a citizen that willingly and gladly and happily shares private information, private health information, location data, all kinds of information. And of course you can say, well, I'm already on the Google and I'm on Facebook and I'm on all these media, so how does it matter if the government has this information? Well, it matters when you start centralizing this information, and it matters when you put it as a kind of a moral calling. So like in Norway, we are being told that that in order to reopen the economy, we must be good citizens, and it's a part of a common project to kind of save ourselves economically. And of course, there is a certain conditioning that has been happening which has enabled this kind of paradigm to win. And I would say that you can go back to looking at works by Richard Sennett, for instance, where you had the disappearance of the distinction between the private and the public. So in the Fall of the Public Man, you can clearly see how the idea of the public and of privacy has been eroding. And of course, with the rise of Instagram and all these YouTube and you name it, you have been clearly conditioned to reveal incredible amounts about yourself. And no longer do we see people taking privacy actually very seriously, except for privacy advocates and few activist organizations, but the vast majority of people are very happy to share their data quite without questioning the consequences. And I think that there has been some contributions talking about apocalypticism and cannibalism, and I think that we could think of cannibalism also in the sense of Instagram and all these media where we are basically consuming each other more and more. And I think this is the cannibalistic medium proper, actually. And at the same time, we have witnessed the rise of kind of therapy culture. So you have this therapy culture where you have to tell everything about yourself, and that has become naturalized, no? And I think that the distinction between let's say liberal democracies versus authoritarian countries is basically minimal. What we are encouraged in the liberal democracies to do is to joyfully and happily submit ourselves. I think here you can draw easily on the work of Frederick Lordon, who's been writing about being the willing slaves of capital. So we are supposed to willingly and happily embrace our servitude, and we do it with the best ethical consciousness. So this is, I think, that this new mode of being, and of course, in a way, a totalitarian system that is explicit about being totalitarian is easy to combat than a system where you have to willingly submit. I think that when this is the first point that I want to make, is that the system is basically totalitarian, no matter, irrespective of the regime. So the technology itself bears with itself a certain mode of rule. And I think we can remember here the work of Günther Anders. Günther Anders was the husband of Hannah Arendt, and in 1958 he wrote a really nice essay called The Obsolescence of Privacy, where he writes about bugging devices and all surveillance technologies back in the day, that not only are these machines characteristic of totalitarianism, they also create totalitarianism. This inversion is no less consequential than the thesis itself, where bugging devices are used as a matter of course. The main precondition of totalitarianism has been established and totalitarianism is achieved. It makes no difference whether the hypothetical state A makes use of bugging devices because it is totalitarian, or whether the hypothetical state B becomes totalitarian because it uses such machines. The end result will be the same. If they use such machines without scruple, state A and B will soon start to look so much like twins that no one will be interested in knowing which was the former and which was the latter. And I think this is exactly the point that we are seeing these days, that the distinction between China and Norway is increasingly shrinking because of these technologies, even if we might be reluctant to recognize this. And of course, the second question that we must ask is, okay, we can argue that the state of exception legitimizes the use of these technologies, that the circumstances are extraordinary and so on. But what are the solutions? What is the ideology behind the solutions that the tech industry is trying to sell us? So they are telling us the data is beautiful, the data is hard, the data is pure, that it is truth, that it is objective, that it is neutral, that it is emotion-free and rational. And we are bombarded since the very beginning of the crisis with graphs, with statistics, with numbers, and it all looks perfectly scientific and so on. And of course, the NHS, for instance, has contracted Palantir, the company owned by Peter Thiel, which is a data mining company and intelligence company developing predictive policing technologies and similar. And on the UK governmental website, you can read that, that this kind of data, this kind of technology will enable disparate data to be integrated, cleaned, and harmonized in order to develop the single source of truth that will support decision making. So we're basically being told that the same industry that has created all these fake profiles, social bots, and so on, is the very industry that will cut through this nonsense and will deliver the objective truth. Of course, as any kind of social scientist will tell you, there is nothing like objective data. Data and raw data is an oxymoron, right? It depends on who chooses the data, how the data is chosen, and so on. And if you look into the works by critical algorithmic studies and critical scholars who have been working on technologies such as predictive policing, the use of artificial intelligence in the criminal justice system, and so on, they will clearly show you that there is an enormous amount of bias that is built into all these data sets. There is racist and sexist, not built necessarily into the data, but it becomes as a consequence, these models become racist and sexist. It reproduces all sorts of societal prejudices and so on. And it functions as self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think the point I want to make here is that when you see a world where inequality is increasing, where injustice is bound to multiply, and at that moment, you use technology that is bound to exaggerate all these differences, then you might be in trouble. And of course, we already see how this kind of algorithmic governance functions in our lives. Insurance, how much you pay for insurance is determined by algorithms, determined by your data. If you're being hired or not, if you receive a bank loan, and so on. The point that is happening, what is happening now, and the shift that is happening that I think is important to consider, is that so far this technology has been determining your life in certain sense, but largely in the private sector. Secondly, it has been relying on behavioral nudging. So you have been basically pushed into certain directions by the technology itself to change your behavior and so on. But with what we're seeing with the rise of this new kind of surveillance technology coming after COVID is that we're moving towards a punitive technology, right? So basically the law itself is built into the technology, and the police itself is backing up the power, the decisions, the algorithmic decisions made by the technology is backed up by the lawful power of violence of the state, basically. So this I think is what we have to consider. And Patrick Zuskind has nicely shown how this kind of future politics would operate. But of course, the final consequence of this, and I think the question that we have to ask is of course, none of these solutions address the actual root causes of any of these problems. They are basically technological solutions to the symptoms of a diseased neoliberal system that has been underfunding healthcare, underfunding education, underfunding, you name it, and has been producing massive inequalities. And so I think we have to ask if we go along the lines of more and more of this form of technocratic post-political governance, if we end up with a totalitarian system without any accountability, where human rights do not matter, where privacy doesn't matter, and where our movement, our freedom of movement, our freedom of assembly is determined by codes that we receive on the app. And if the app says that you have a red code, then you can't leave your home, and you might even risk a jail time. So I think those are the questions that we should be also thinking about. Yes, so I think that this is enough from me at the moment, and for my Indian colleagues, I can say Sune ke liye bahut dhanyawad aur shukriya.
Thank you, Professor Kuldova. That was, as you promised, in sharp contrast to Professor Besson's paper, frightening the heck out of all of us, or is it frightening the heck into all of us? I'm not quite sure where we stand. But thank you for that. We'll move on to Professor Vanessa Lee's presentation now. Professor Lee, are you on?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Okay, right. Here you go.
Great. First of all, I'd like to thank the conference organizers for having me. And this has been my first virtual conference, so it's been a very interesting experience. So thank you. So for this talk, I'm going to be drawing from my research, but also my own interest in art practices and specifically theatre, namely in postcolonial studies. And this call for papers for this conference has sort of prompted me to think about my research in the context of what is happening to all of us today. So I will begin. So this paper will discuss how postcolonial art can help us imagine a post-corona world. I would like to point out, first of all, that a number of my examples will be taken from Caribbean and specifically Francophone Caribbean contexts, since much of my research has focused on these areas. But I also like to talk about the Caribbean because its theorists and artists have shaped multiple aspects of postcolonial studies, foregrounding the notions of multiplicity, diversity, and cultural mixing that should be at the heart of any reflection on global society. When explaining to a lay audience the term postcolonial, one inevitably goes through the process of outlining its multiple definitions. But often one distinguishes between, on the one hand, the postcolonial as a temporal marker between a nation's colonized status and its independence, and on the other hand, postcolonialism as a conceptual, philosophical, political, and cultural framework through which to examine the impact of colonialism and through which to engage with hegemonic discourses more broadly. Art created in a post-colonial context addresses multiple issues. This could be a nation's colonial history and the residual effects on society of imperial domination. It could also be the establishment of post-colonial, post-independent nation states. And postcolonial art can also look at the formation of diasporas born out of migrations during and after the colonial period. Overall, it is the questioning of hegemonic and imperial epistemologies and the exploration of power relations and violence that are often the main focus of postcolonial artworks. It is this questioning aspect that interests me particularly, because this crisis has led to a considerable questioning of mentalities and institutions worldwide. It has not only emphasized the divides between rich and poor and what is sometimes termed the global north and global south, it has not only reinforced inequalities within national and global communities, but it has also underlined that established disciplines and institutions are not immutable and infallible. One example of such a questioning of knowledge formations from the post-colonial canon can be found in the work of Edouard Glissant, an author from the French Caribbean territory of Martinique. In his work Caribbean Discourse, published in 1981, Glissant argues for a reassessment of history as a discipline. He criticizes the rigidity of the Western historical approach and its incompatibility with the lived experiences of the Caribbean people. And he also argues for a more flexible, creative, and transdisciplinary approach to history. I quote, "As far as we are concerned, history as a consciousness at work and history as lived experience are therefore not the business of historians exclusively. Literature for us will not be divided into genres, but will implicate all the perspectives of the human sciences," end quote. Several decades before the publication of this work by Glissant, French Caribbean writers were already rejecting established disciplines and the rigidity of thought systems imposed by colonial powers. One of these authors include Suzanne Cesare, wife of the politician and poet Aimé Césaire, whom some of you may know. Suzanne Cesare wrote several articles on the Surrealist movement, on Caribbean and Black identity, and on the future of Caribbean literature. In her article, The Great Camouflage, published in 1945, Cesare critiques the exotic and colonial representations of the Caribbean, which had been the norm in literature about the region since the 18th century. She writes, quote, "Literature? Yes, exotic literature, sugar and vanilla-coated literature, literary tourism, but poetry? Certainly not," end quote. Cesare called for a new form of Caribbean literature, written by the locals about their own experiences. This new literature would draw from I quote, "the mobilization of all the live forces mixed into this land where race is the result of constant mixing, and the awakening to the incredible amassing of diverse energies that we have kept locked within ourselves," end quote. Although Suzanne Cesare's own writing career was cut short by her premature death at the age of 51, a number of writers of her generation and those that followed fulfilled this vision of a new Caribbean literature. So post-colonial writing and art show us how the world has changed and how the world should change. While it is true that art has often been associated with post-colonial nation building, I would rather focus on the transnational potential of post-colonial art forms and how post-colonial thinking and creation establish links between cultures and experiences as manifested in multiple art movements of the 20th and 21st century. We could cite, for instance, the development in the Americas and Europe during the 20th century of art and philosophical movements dedicated to the articulation, exploration, and celebration of the Black experience. Many of these movements and schools of thought inspired, collaborated, and interacted with each other. Members of the American Harlem Renaissance frequented the Parisian literary salons of the French Caribbean Nardal sisters in the 1920s. Subsequently, the Nardals went on to explore the concept of universal Blackness from a Francophone perspective. What is more, the future founders of the French language Négritude movement, Léopold Sédar Senghor, Aimé Césaire, and Léon Gontran Damas, also frequented these salons and were inevitably exposed to these debates. At the same time as the Négritude movement was developing, another movement was taking hold of Western art, and that was Surrealism. It is now established that artists and writers who belonged to that movement exchanged and collaborated with writers of the Négritude and other anti-colonial movements. One such collaboration was that between the Frenchman André Breton, author of the Surrealist Manifesto, who in 1941 met Suzanne Cesare and Aimé Césaire, whom I mentioned above, on a stopover in Martinique in the French Caribbean while traveling to the United States. This led to a number of collaborations and epistolary exchanges between the two parties. Now, it has been argued that some of these Western artists' own residual colonial and exoticist prejudices skewed their relations with post-colonial and anti-colonial artists and thinkers. André Breton, for instance, wrote poetry inspired by his stay in Martinique, which at times echoed the exotic stereotypes Suzanne Cesare had criticized previously. However, in spite of this, Western artists shared and participated in the dissemination of the worldview that the world needn't be perceived through colonial or imperial epistemologies that had dictated the production of knowledge and culture and the relations between peoples up until that point. There could and had to be another way of perceiving the world, and art was one of the ways this view was conveyed, both in the context of the surrealist and anti-colonial movements. And in this new age of which we are on the cusp, all must participate and contribute to a new imaginary. And concepts useful to reflecting on this new global imaginary include those of island thinking and of Creoleness. These are useful tools with which to conceive of a collective experience which also celebrates difference and singularity. Island thinking, devised by Edouard Besson, whom I cited above, brings different populations, cultures, and identities together. Besson uses the Caribbean as the template for this, since it is geographically a series of archipelagos and islands divided by the sea, but linked by what he calls a cross-cultural relationship. Creoleness, as defined by Jean Bernabé, Patrick Chamoiseau, and Raphaël Confiant in their article In Praise of Creoleness, is, quote, the interactional or transactional aggregate of Caribbean, European, African, Asian, and Levantine cultural elements united on the same soil by the yoke of history, end quote. They refer here to the history of many Caribbean islands, which were successively inhabited by indigenous populations, European colonizers, enslaved Africans, and migrants from East Asia and the Middle East who arrived in the Caribbean following the abolition of slavery. But Creoleness is also found outside the Americas. At its core, Confiant, Bernabé, and Chamoiseau argue, Creoleness, quote, refers to the brutal interaction on either insular or landlocked territories of culturally different populations, end quote. A good artistic example of the shared experience of Creoleness in different parts of the world is the 1996 play Cross Currents by Gertrude Ambury, who is from Guadeloupe, another French Caribbean overseas territory. The play is a reflection on the Indian diaspora found in French colonies throughout the world. Another example, this time of Creolness as a result of cultural mixing and interactions, is the music culture of soca in Trinidad, which developed in the 1970s and melded East Asian and African rhythms. Overall, Creolness is, quote, an annihilation of false universality, of monolingualism, and of purity. It is in harmony with diversity. We bend towards it, enriched by all kinds of mistakes and confident of the necessity of accepting ourselves as complex, end quote. And it is this non-fixity, this celebration of multiplicity and the sharing of a similar experience that can be an inspiration when conceptualizing our different and at times widely diverging experiences of this pandemic. Postcolonial art forms also address the trauma of colonial and/or slave pasts of former colonized societies. The healing ability of art is crucial to the acceptance and reclaiming of a tormented past. It is also a means of redressing inequalities between different regions and cultural contexts. One particularly vibrant example is the 1989 play In the Time of the Revolution by Maryse Condé from Guadeloupe. A sweeping epic with over 60 characters set in Guadeloupe, Paris, and Haiti, the play relates events ranging from the French and Haitian revolutions to the first abolition and then reinstatement of slavery in Guadeloupe. The play not only portrayed the three parallel and sometimes intertwined histories of Haiti, France, and Guadeloupe, it also asserted the equal relevance of Haiti's and Guadeloupe's histories in relation to France's history. In the Time of the Revolution premiered in Guadeloupe at the historical location of Fort Fleur d'Épée, where some of the events depicted in the play took place. And so the production reclaimed Guadeloupean history, not just in its script, but also in this choice of setting, since it reconnected local audiences with their own spatial histories. Neither history is privileged over the other in this play. And so perhaps in future, the fact that no single experience should trump another should be considered when devising the historical narrative of this pandemic. Other types of art forms that have been argued to provide a healing force is that of dance. As Helen Gilbert and Joanne Tompkins point out, dance, being an extremely physical type of performance, quote, often functions as a mode of empowerment for oppressed characters, particularly when their attempts to articulate themselves verbally have been compromised by the imposition of an alien language, end quote. They also argue that dance, quote, offers potential liberation from imperialist representation through the construction of an active, moving body that speaks its own forms of corporeality, end quote. Patrick Chamoiseau has written on the development of dance in Martinique in the French Caribbean, tracing it back to the slave plantations, where music and dance allowed enslaved persons to express their trauma. Chamoiseau writes, quote, through the rhythms, the person suffocated in the slave emerges, end quote. Dance in this context was also a means of reconnecting with ancestors and ancestral modes of performance and expression through an embodied memory. And I've written about embodied memory in of the articles. And so perhaps there is no prescribed way of remembrance if we return to Glissant's argument that history need not be confined to a discipline and that it should rather be a communal and participatory process. When we remember this crisis, perhaps other forms of expression may be necessary. So to conclude, I have shown in this paper the multiple ways in which postcolonial art can help us to conceive of a post-corona global imaginary, through its questioning of established discourses, through its celebration of diversity, through its healing ability, and through its redressing the balance between different experiences. It's vital not to underestimate the importance of art in post-colonial contexts and world history more broadly. And so my main message would be not to dismiss artistic practice and creativity, because these could be instrumental to the forging of new imaginaries post-coronavirus. Thank you.
Thank you, Celine. We have time for a couple of questions. I see that there has been a question addressed to Dr. Kuldova, and she has written a long text. I do not know whether that is shareable with everybody. I think
everybody can see it.
Has everyone seen the text of the question? Om, I don't know how this is.
No, it isn't. No, it's not on the screen.
Oh, all right, then I'll read out first the question, Jagdish Batra's question to Dr. Kuldova. This is the way the question goes, and then I'll read out Kuldova's answer. You have quite forcefully dwelt on the dangers of technology helping totalitarianism. In these times when information technology supports our lives at every juncture, how can we avoid these dangers? Do you have any suggestions for alternatives, if any? Tereza Kuldova's answer goes like this. A fundamentally systemic change would be needed to transgress the Silicon Valley ideology of socialism, which is increasingly embraced by governments. It would require people recognizing the dangers and violence of algorithmic governance that disproportionately punishes those already disadvantaged. A recognition that prediction is far too often merely a self-fulfilling prophecy. It would require a demand from the public for politics proper, a critical thinking about data, interests, and power within digital capitalism, and widespread rejection of the pseudo-solutions. Unless we collectively rise and demand real protection of rights, regulation of the tech industry, and develop an alternative political imaginary, I don't see it happening. There is a question. Is there anybody else who wants to add to the question that Jagdish Batra has asked? Or shall I just move on to the next one? All right, by the time you formulate a question, those in the audience, here is Professor Johan Hogland. Thank you for these three very interesting presentations. And a question for Vanessa. It strikes me that postcolonial studies as a discipline and postcolonial art as an intervention are unusually well poised to interrogate the various crises that have followed in the wake of the pandemic. Again, these are not new crises. They were already unfolding, and postcolonial studies have been talking to them for a long time. But if we look ahead, can you see examples of post-colonial writers and artists in the Caribbean and other places that have begun to shape new post-corona works? Did you get to all of that, Vanessa?
Yes, I did. Thank you.
Yeah, right. Please go ahead.
I would like my answer first? Or?
Yeah, I think you can respond by the time. Yeah, please.
Okay, yes. Well, since a lot of artists are actually in confinement or in self-isolation, it has been very difficult for them to actually produce work, particularly in art forms that are collaborative and also very sort of physical, that need a physical presence. But I feel that a certain number of writers have intervened in terms of writing about the crisis and shedding light, on the experiences of persons that we don't normally think about, especially in the global south or in post-colonial countries. So there's that sort of intervention happening. But I think it would be useful to think about how other forms of art can be used to reflect on what has happened, and particularly forms of communal art that bring people together in order to articulate a new communal consciousness. But this is all very theoretical at this point because everybody is still in lockdown in many places. But I'm looking forward to seeing what happens in the future. But obviously a lot of art forms will suffer as well due to funding cuts, but that's the case of many other areas in society. So yes.
Unless people start practicing digital art forms
yes,
with just materials available in and around their homes when they're in lockdown mode.
Yes, absolutely. It's just whether one has access.
You want to do that, yes. I think so.
Mm.
Yeah, right. Anyone else has any questions for the arguments made by Professor Besson about interspecies worlding and ecosystems? Om?
I'm there, sir.
Yeah, have you received anything that is not visible to me on screen by way of a question for Professor Besson? Or
there is one question from Professor Greta Gard.
Okay, I have not seen, it's not here, so perhaps you could read it out.
Yes, and that is for Tereza. Tereza. Hello.
Tereza is on mute. Yes, unmute yourself. Yes.
Yeah, good. Fine. So I'm reading it out. This question is from Professor Greta Gard, and she asks that, have you heard anything about 5G wireless network that sends burning laser-like rays to protesters or those seen as disrupting the public?
Well, I don't know about that, but I mean the technology that is required to stop protests or these things that is already there. There is no need for.
Yeah, then she has shared a link which I will pass it on to you.
Yeah, I can't see that.
Yes, sure, sure. So,
are you putting it up for everyone, or is that link?
No, it's visible, sir. It's visible on the question and answer panel. It's visible.
Okay.
All right. Okay. There's a question from Dr. Shailendra Singh to all panelists. Postcolonialism routinely ignores vernacular literatures. What do you have to say about it? Postcolonialism routinely ignores vernacular literatures. What do you have to say about it?
Well, I'd say that when I was talking about post-colonialism, I wasn't necessarily talking about the discipline, namely that developed in like by English-speaking intellectuals, and I was talking more about art produced in post-colonial context, worldwide, and I was just referring to specific areas. But it's true that there have been debates about language and within post-colonial studies, and it's true that it seems that literatures that are published in former colonized languages tend to be privileged, but I think there's a lot of work on vernacular literatures as well. But I was just focusing on different examples, but that's a very important question that's often being debated about.
There are two questions also on technology which have come up. Bhavesh Modi, I assume this will be addressed to Tereza. Is technology become superior in place for emotional teacher? That's one. The other one seems to have just disappeared now.
Yeah.
Right. I have no idea what that is supposed to mean. Tereza will have something to say about surveillance. The question has been popped and the question withdrawn.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. So, no.
Have you seen the question? Did you get it? No. Okay. Right. Okay. But now there's another question that has come from Arvind Jadhav. Besson has reflected. It's not quite a question, like comment. Professor Besson has reflected greatly about us as human. Simplicity and being natural with less consuming are the things we learned during and from lockdown. Yeah, right. And does anybody else have anything? I'm sorry, that question seems to have disappeared. I can't see that.
It's okay.
All right, okay. So are we done, or Om, does your team have any other question?
Yes, sir. We can move on to the next, the last session of the day.
Right. Thank you all then, Professor Besson, Professor Kuldova, and Professor Vanessa Lee.
Thank you.
Right. Bye.
Bye.